Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances in the Remevsk Ledge direction where the Russians launched a new offensive operation. The Russians also continue the offensive operations near Kurakhove, advancing further within the settlement itself and to the north of it. The Ukrainians managed to recapture some territory in a counterattack within Toretsk, where the tide has turned in favor of the Ukrainians, ever since the Russians switched to the defensive to focus their offensive in the Kursk and Kurakhove directions. The Russians in the Kursk region managed to recapture some positions near Novosilka. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to advance here to capture Rifnopil, northwest of Sermeyovsk, and with an advance towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians west of Makarivka and along the main road between Sermeyovsk and Rifnopil, capturing the settlement itself in a single assault. At the same time, the Russians crossed the river line further to the west to fight in the direction of Novosilka, leaving the settlement and the surrounding fortified positions in the gray zone. So with this, the Russians are now pushing towards the road here connecting Velyka Novosilka with the Zaporizhia region, capturing Rifnopil and now fighting over Novosilka will allow the Russians to then push towards Novopil, which will allow the Russians to have fire control over the road connected between Remivka and the Velyka Novosilka direction and the Zaporizhia region. This Russian push spans about 4 kilometers in distance and is now 8 kilometers from the Dnipropetrovsk region. It also covers approximately 15 square kilometers of advances, with these three counted separately. In the northeastern direction towards Kurakhove, there are two significant advances. The Russians managed to enter Delnya, capturing several fortified positions of the Ukrainians and entering the settlement itself, as is confirmed with this geolocated footage. With this, the Russians are contesting a settlement that is extremely important for the supply between Kurakhove and Uspinivka, and subsequently the entire village chain of the Ukrainian forces here to the east. This means that the pocket between the Ukrainian forces stuck between the two sides of Delnya to the north and Velyka to the south is very close to closing. There is 7 kilometers between the two tips. However, if we take a look at the supply line itself, there's less than 2 kilometers between the Russian positions and the road in the northern direction, and the Russians are already within 3 kilometers to the secondary road, which is to the western direction. If Russians gain fire control over both of these roads, connecting the Ukrainian forces to Kurakhove in both directions, as well as the one going in a western direction, the Ukrainian forces in this entire pocket, including the settlements of Antonivka, Ilinka, Yelisavetivka, Romahivka, Veselyhanivka, Uspinivka and Trudovo would all be cut off, and the Russians could close this entire pocket, which spans approximately 90 square kilometers of fortified positions, villages, and a whole lot of fields and forest lines, which the Ukrainians are using to conduct defensive operations. The close proximity between the two sides shows as to the imminent danger of the Ukrainian forces located here in the east, which includes a mechanized brigade and airborne brigade which has Western equipment and well-trained soldiers who are conducting active defensive operations, which have prevented the Russians from making significant gains here in the eastern side, where we simply have to take a quick glance to see that the Ukrainians have been managing to defend much better here in the eastern direction near Antonivka, Katerinivka, and Yelisavetivka compared to the southern flank with Boyavlenka, Novokrainka, Maximivka, and in the northern direction where the defenses near Kurakhove, which I seem extremely well fortified, and to the northern direction where the Russians have simply advanced after advance, where in the eastern direction between Novomikhailivka and Katerinivka, the fighting simply spanned over half a year before the Russians advanced this small section. This shows to the difference in the quality of the Ukrainian soldiers that are available for the defense of these locations and how difficult it was for the Russians to push through. Yet these forces are now in danger of encirclement, similar to the Velyka direction, where the Ukrainians managed to hold back Russian advances for over 2 years, but following the capture of the settlement and the collapse of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, which was defending the settlement, the Russians simply captured this entire section of the front line. This means similarly, the collapse of this pocket here could lead to the Russians capturing a significant portion of Ukrainian territory moving forward in a similar manner to the collapse of Velyka. Within Kurakhove itself, the Russians have managed to reach school number 3 and have captured significant territory in the eastern residential area. As I previously split the settlement up into multiple parts. There's the eastern residential area, the central residential area, the high-rise apartment complex buildings, and the industrial area. The Russians are now fighting within the eastern residential area, where the Russians have managed to capture approximately half of it, leaving about 10% in the gray zone, and reportedly the remaining 40% under Ukrainian control. The Russians have gained the upper hand in the eastern residential area. At the same time, the Russians have also advanced within Velyka itself, where they are leaving the Ukrainians to the outskirts, pushing them out of the settlement itself after getting control over the fortified positions. Following that, they'll be fighting over Novosilka and Toretsk here to the west, where the Russians can flank these fortified positions from a push from Novosilka, where heavy fighting is taking place in the direction of Novosilka, and the Russians will launch offensive operations south of Novosilka once they consolidate these gains. Further north, the Russians have started pushing into Yurivka as well. Following the capture of Novosilka, the Russians are now pushing on to the next settlement, gaining a foothold in the forest patches and buildings in the southeastern outskirts of the settlement, which is a small village. At the same time, the Russians, with the capture of Petrivka, can flank the Ukrainian positions near Pustinka and gain control over these two settlements as well, before pushing onwards towards Pushkine, where the Russians are developing offensive operations towards Pokrovsk as they continue fighting in the direction of Kurakhove as well. So we see that the front line here in the southern direction has expanded following the success the Russians have met here to the northwest of Velyka. The success here near Shakhtarsk, Novosilka and so on has allowed the Russians to now expand their offensive operations to the west of the Remersky Ledge direction, where the Russians are taking full advantage of the recent success to cut off all supply lines to Velyka and Novosilka, both from the eastern direction with the capture of these settlements, and now from the western direction as well. This will lead to a very limited supply to Velyka and Novosilka and the deterioration of the Ukrainian defensive capabilities in the area. For every stronghold the Russian captures, the Ukrainian defensive capabilities significantly decreases. In the direction of Toretsk, with the Ukrainian armed forces continuously launching counterattacks on Russian positions that weren't properly consolidated, the Ukrainians have met with a lot of success. First, they managed to recapture the southern district of Toretsk, and now they are managing to push the Russians back to the outskirts of the industrial area, and they are pushing them in the high-rise apartment complex areas, flanking their positions as well. This success is met due to the Russian forces not properly consolidating their positions. This meant that they had some weak points which the Ukrainians exploited, and due to that the Russians have switched from active offensive operations to consolidating their current positions, setting up defensive lines, and then returning to offensive operations. This means that we are currently seeing a very hot and active phase in the Toretsk direction, where the Ukrainians are attempting to push the Russians out before they establish a proper footing, and the Russians are trying to establish themselves properly within the city before returning to offensive operations. This is some decisive battles, because if the Ukrainians manage to push the Russians out of the apartment complex area, they'll be pushed back a significant portion, and they would have to send reinforcements to properly establish their positions and regain access to apartment complex buildings. The apartment complex area is very significant because if we take a closer look, we can see here there are the Terikon Hills west of the southern district of Toretsk. Then there are some hills here in the eastern parts And if we take a look from a leveled perspective, we can see exactly how much of an elevation difference there is between the hills and the regular ground. From the top of these hills, we can overlook and see the entire area of the district and the industrial area, apartment complex area, and so on. However, we can also see the other hills here in the background. From the perspective of these hills, we move back up. Here on the right side, we can see that the entire city of Toretsk as well is in the view from this hill. Now, the issue the Russians are facing in comparison to the Ukrainians is taking a look at the apartment complex buildings. These are taller buildings. They aren't exactly shown in 3D on this map, but based on what we know, taller buildings, they are, well, taller than the remaining parts, while in the other areas, the Terikon Hills are tall enough to allow both sides to take a closer look at exactly where units are, allowing them to monitor movement in real time and communicate that to the other soldiers, possibly located within the hills themselves, to provide direct fire control and other equipment moving around the fortified positions. The Russians, where they were fighting here in the apartment complex area, from the perspective of this hill right here, if we take a close look, we can see that the Ukrainian forces can look towards these apartment complex buildings and see what happens in between them, because there's nothing blocking their views. In comparison, if we take a look from the southern side, there will be no such opportunity, because the apartment complex area has a wall of these apartment complex buildings in the southern direction, which simply blocks the view of the Terikon Hill. This means in the apartment complex area, it is difficult for the Russians to monitor the movement of the Ukrainians. Naturally, they have drones, but there's electronic warfare systems, there is soldiers who are going to be shooting down these drones, and there's other drones that are going to be shooting down these drones. In conclusion, what I'm saying is that as long as the Ukrainians control these Terikon Hills, it is very difficult for the Russians to capture the apartment complex area. It's difficult for them to attack and capture the industrial area, and it's difficult for them to control the southern district, which the Ukrainians are all having the upper hand. And this is exactly why I determined that the fight over the high-rise apartment complex area and the industrial area will determine the outcome of the Battle of Toretsk. Whoever controls these two locations will allow them to control the Terikon Hills in the western parts, which will allow them to control the entire city. This means that the Russians don't need to capture this entire part, nor the eastern parts, nor the northern parts, nor the southern parts to gain control over the settlement. They need to capture this small section here, and capturing that will lead to full control over the city, and not just the city, but the surrounding settlements here to the west of the city as well. This means that the Russians need to gain control over these Terikon Hills, but it is a very difficult task. And they can't simply provide proper air cover, which would allow the Russians to capture these hills, because that is the one thing the Russians have a significant advantage on. It is the firepower. Artillery is not good enough to provide proper cover for this. Sure, they can heavily bombard the area at a very long time to keep the Ukrainian forces suppressed and then move through the district. They still have to clear the district, which takes a very long time, so they can't provide artillery cover for the Russians to capture this entire area, clear it, and then move on to the Terikon Hills. Nor can they do that in the industrial area, because they can provide cover enough for them to move on to the hill. Well, then the Ukrainian forces in the southern direction will be able to attack those forces, as they will be exposed to moving up towards the Terikon Hill, and they would also be at risk of shooting their own men. In the end, the most clear answer would be a sort of aerial assault towards these Terikon Hills, but again, the Ukrainian forces are simply located within these areas, which means that they have stingers, they have anti-air components, and they also have anti-air components further behind, which can shoot down these helicopters or air force. So it is a very difficult question to solve, and not one that is easily explainable. Instead, the Ukrainians as it is right now, are having the upper hand in this direction, and the Russians have not found a solution to counteract this situation. Therefore, based on the experience of this war, the only solution I can think of for the Russian side is to simply not attempt it. If it is something where you have a significant disadvantage and it's very difficult for you to succeed, then the objective should be to make the best of the situation. And in this scenario, the Russians can make off Toretsk like they did off Bakhmut and simply turn to the defensive, force the Ukrainians to counterattack, and just simply inflict as many casualties as possible on the Ukrainian forces and hold on to their positions, forcing the Ukrainians to direct their forces towards Toretsk, so creating an illusion that the Russians are launching an offensive operation, while in reality it is a defensive one. Now, that is something that is beyond my own understanding, so let's just leave it there and then move on to the Kursk direction, where we see that the Russians have yet again secured Novosilka, the very hotly contested settlement here in the Kursk region, as heavy fighting continues over the pockets of the Ukrainian forces, which is much less evident now, as the Russians have slowly closed on it from the sides and are pushing the Ukrainians back, where the Ukrainians still have a very solid supply line in and out of the settlement. As long as the Russians does not pressure Malaya Luknia properly, then the Ukrainian forces are not in danger of encirclement, from which we see that the Russian efforts continue towards the pressure towards Malaya Luknia, but there is at this point limited Ukrainian forces here in the northern direction. Instead, they are focused around the railway area, but then again, that is also to the advantage of the Russians, because they can simply concentrate their fire at a smaller area, inflicting more casualties on the Ukrainians. The heavy fighting continues in the Kursk region, where the objective of the Russians is to regain control over the region, and the Ukrainians is to hold it out as long as possible, in a similar manner as the Ukrainian counterattacking in Toretsk to regain that. The Russians are attempting to keep them there as long as possible. The Ukrainians have managed to do one thing with the Kursk incursion, and that is relocating some of the new reserves of the Russian army towards the Kursk region, instead of further strengthening their offensive operations in the east. So in a sense, based on that, there could be an advantage to the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, but then again, the merits far and vastly fail compared to the demerits of the Kursk incursion. Any military analyst with a sensible mind and is not spreading pure propaganda knows that the Kursk incursion has been a failure for the Ukrainians, and that the merits simply does not measure up to the consequences of the operation. And if anyone disagrees with me on that point, I am willing to debate it with you live on stream, so that we can have a fair debate and organized discussion on the topic. We can invite third-party judges as well. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.